Your dopamine reward system gets hijacked, and eventually you end up in a position where you can only really derive pleasure or enjoyment from gambling, and everything else just becomes secondary to that and the pursuit of your next bet.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Matt Zarb-Cousin says gambling has become a rite of passage for our youth.
Young people are still growing up in an environment where gambling is marketed relentlessly, and it's this hyper-normalisation of gambling as if it's part of the culture and part of enjoying sport, and young people inevitably will seek that out.
He talks about technology's impact on gambling addiction and why our laws and regulators can't keep up.
We're in an era now where we carry around a casino in our pockets with a smartphone, so all of these things contribute to gambling being more addictive, and I think we have to have policies that take the edge off.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Matt Zarb-Cousin from the Campaign for Fairer Gambling. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So gambling's part of British life, millions of people enjoy it every year, but gambling addiction is a growing problem. Can you start by giving us a bit of background of how someone can get to this point of addiction and what life is like for them?
Yeah, I think my experience of gambling addiction was through machines in betting shops called fixed odds betting terminals. And you used to be able to bet £100 every 20 seconds on roulette. And I got addicted to these machines pretty quickly. It was a matter of weeks, if not sooner. I had a big win early on, and that really distorted my perception of gambling. And then whenever I started losing money, I believed I could chase it and win it back. And it really, what gambling does, gambling addiction is, your dopamine reward system gets hijacked, and eventually you end up in a position where you can only really derive pleasure or enjoyment from gambling, and everything else just becomes secondary to that and the pursuit of your next bet. So it's extremely destructive in that respect. You're thinking about when you're going to gamble next, all the money that you have and have access to goes to gambling, and you rationalise this to yourself by believing you can win your way out of trouble. So it's one of those, it's a very unique addiction in that sense, where you can convince yourself that by doing the thing you're addicted to, you can solve the problems that addiction has caused. And as a result of what happened with me, I got into a huge amount of debt. I sold lots of my possessions. I gambled all the money I had and had access to for about 4 years, and it led me to the point of wanting to take my own life. So that loss of agency and feeling like I wasn't in control of my destiny, I think that's the other aspect to it. And then in recovery, when I quit gambling, thankfully I got help and I was able to quit. And in recovery, it wasn't so much paying back the debts; it was just the fact that my brain was recovering from this, having been subject to this, like, I suppose, irregular dopamine sort of experience where I was just subsumed by this activity, and without it I was experiencing like quite severe withdrawal symptoms. So there's a physiological element to gambling addiction, and because it's not a substance, people don't realise that sometimes, and I think that's important to recognise.
How widespread is this problem?
Some gambling products carry with them higher risks than others for developing addiction or generating harm, gambling-related harm. So if you can regulate products to the extent that they are safer, you can reduce the harm associated with them. So we campaigned for a long time to get the maximum stake on fixed odds betting terminals down to £2 a spin, and that change was made by government in 2019.
So that was £100 before?
It was £100 before. And there are no limits at the moment on stakes for online slots. And the government, in a recent white paper, a review of our gambling laws, decided to limit the maximum stake on online slots to £5 and £2 for under 25s. And obviously that's a step in the right direction, but I think understanding that gambling harm is not, or gambling addiction is not just about an individual's failure to control their gambling. It's also there are also other factors like the product they're engaging with, the accessibility of that product, the delivery mechanism. We're in an era now where we carry around a casino in our pockets with a smartphone. So all of these things contribute to gambling being more addictive, and I think we have to have policies that take the edge off. There's lots of, I think, products, even though regulated gambling is only accessible to 18-year-olds, online gambling anyway. I mean, we do allow young people, I think we're the only country in the world that allows it by law young people to gamble, because we allow them to engage with seaside amusement arcades and all that sort of stuff, and that's regulated as gambling. But for sort of harder gambling products, they're restricted to 18 and over, but young people are still growing up in an environment where gambling is marketed relentlessly, and it's this hyper-normalisation of gambling as if it's part of the culture and part of enjoying sport. And young people inevitably will seek that out, and whether that's gambling with friends, or whether that's getting other people to put bets on for them, or gambling in video games such as loot boxes or skins betting. And there's a whole ecosystem of online games like that basically allow you to trade and gamble with items that you might purchase within the game or win within the game. So this becomes an alternative form of currency. There's also crypto as well, which has no age restriction. So I think lots of these gambling derivative products are very appealing to young people because they're growing up in that climate, in that environment where gambling is seen to be everywhere. I mean, when you and I were growing up, we were thinking, when we turn 18, we'll have a drink for the first time, or a legal drink anyway. Now, young people are growing up, the first thing they do when they turn 18 is download the gambling apps.
Right.
And get all the offers and the bonuses, and that's seen as the rite of passage. And that's because they've been marketed to for years and years before they turn 18, similar to when we were marketed to by alcohol companies with alcohol pops and all that sort of stuff. That is already happening. We're seeing the consequences of that, which there's obviously been a latency period, but we're seeing that now.
In terms of the advertising, so the Gambling Commission said the industry brings in 15 billion a year, and they spend about 10% on advertising. So that's 1.5 billion. And it's pretty massive. You see the adverts everywhere now. Do you think that's contributing considerably to this problem?
Yeah, and I think it really, that's a slight distortion, because most of the advertising is for online gambling, and online gambling gross revenue is about 6 billion. So you're talking about, really, it's more like a fifth of the gross revenues that go back into marketing. And the reason for that is because the gambling industry, or the online sector, derives 86% of its profits from 5% of its customers. So when you have a business model that is skewed towards encouraging people to lose more than they can afford, that is basically relying on people that are developing gambling problems for its commercial model, you have your most important customers are likely to go broke, and therefore you need to replace them. So you have this constant need to either convert the 95% into the 5% by direct marketing, whether that's through behavioural profiling or whatever it is, to try to get people to gamble more, to engage more, cross-promotion to the more addictive products. But then you also have to replace the customers that you have, because they're self-excluding, because they need to quit, because they've lost more than they can afford, and they've done considerable harm to themselves. So that for me is an unsustainable commercial model. It's also unsustainable politically, because you can't allow a sector that is ostensibly one that has the potential to cause harm or significant harm to people, to just leave this trail of destruction in its wake. And the marketing and the constant marketing that's relentless is really a symptom of that. It's absolutely necessary for the industry within their current commercial model to get new customers, to acquire new customers, instead of looking after the customers that they have.
Can you talk to us a bit about the techniques they use to kind of get people to spend more, particularly on the online gambling?
Yeah, online gambling companies know a lot about their customers, much more than I think people who gamble realise. They will use very, very sophisticated methods to profile individuals. They'll use not just data harvesting techniques that optimise profiling based on how you gamble, so to try to figure out what you like gambling on and how to get you to gamble more. But they'll also use third-party data sources to build that profile, such as information about you and how much money you have and whereabouts you live. And really they have the information already to make a judgment call on whether someone is gambling more than they can afford or likely to be. So in Britain we've had this quite ludicrous debate about affordability checks and about whether that's a reasonable thing for operators to request, to be able to carry out, to have that information on their users. But the reality is they have a huge amount of data on their users already. They're just using it to maximise engagement and maximise profit.
So that affordability check, we would somehow check what they earn and see whether they can afford to spend more.
Yes, so the idea would be that if someone's gambling excessively, then they would give permission to the operator to assess whether that gambling is affordable or not. And they can use all sorts of metrics to do this. They could use, or methods, they could use like open banking, or there's lots of other ways you could do it that's very basically frictionless for the user. And the gambling industry has obviously been arguing from the perspective of this is like an intrusion, this is against people's civil liberties and all this sort of stuff. But the reality is they're already doing this. They're already harvesting personal data, but they're doing it for commercial ends. And the Information Commissioner's Office in Britain, the data regulator, is trying at the moment to look at how the gambling industry is using this information for marketing, for direct marketing, and whether that's lawful or not, and they're due to report on that soon.
As well as the online gambling, there's also so many betting shops now. They seem to have appeared all over our towns and cities. Why are there so many?
So this is a legacy of the 2005 Gambling Act. So what the 2005 Gambling Act did in Britain, liberalised our gambling laws, and it removed something called the demand test. So you used to have to go, if you were a betting shop and you wanted to open another premises, you used to have to go and prove to the local authority that there was demand for that. Right. And the presumption was that there wasn't demand and you had to prove there was. And what the 2005 Gambling Act did was it shifted that burden to aim to permit. So the local authorities had to allow the premises unless it could be proved that the premises was going to contravene the licensing objectives in the Gambling Act, which are that gambling has to be fair and open, can't be associated with crime, and can't harm the young or vulnerable. And it's been very, very difficult for local authorities to object on these grounds. So basically, liberalisation of planning and liberalisation of the licensing requirements has meant that betting shops can open multiple premises. And they did this initially because they were only allowed 4 fixed odds betting terminals per shop. Right. And in order to maximise the number of machines in an area, they would just basically leapfrog that by opening lots of shops. Right. Well, so those machines made so much money as well. Yeah. Opening shop for. Yeah, the machines were the biggest revenue driver for the entire industry per product.
You mentioned when we were younger. I remember gambling then, it existed, and people maybe would have a flutter on the Grand National and stuff, but it was kind of tolerated and in the background. Whereas now it's kind of everywhere. Any sport that you watch, you walk down the street, you see, you go onto your social media, it's there. What things happened to bring about these changes? Was it changes in the law, as you mentioned? Was it changes in technology? Yeah, I think that we made a mistake in 2005 not regulating online gambling from then. Obviously, that legislation was conceived of in sort of 2001. That was when the review took place. That informed it, and smartphones were not around until much later. And I think smartphone gambling is the thing that changed the game. Right. I think it's really become, we started regulating online gambling in 2014, and the ubiquity of smartphones, I think, sort of coincided with that. And I think since then, and obviously 4G and 5G and being able to basically access the internet anywhere with like broadband speed, that has really changed the game. And I think we have to look again at how products that we knew in the 1960s, when we had the Gaming Act in the 1960s, were addictive, like roulette and blackjack and slots. And we said, these are addictive, we'll put them in casinos and we'll
we'll regulate casinos a lot, and we'll basically, if you wanted to go to a casino, there's a 24-hour calling off period if you wanted to sign up as a member, and there was a lot of barriers to entry because we recognised those products were quite addictive. And what we've done since then is basically ignored that principle because of the internet. The internet and this belief, I think, this mistaken belief that we can't regulate the internet has held back controls that would, I think, make a big difference. And it's only now that the government and the Gambling Commission are sort of getting to grips with that, realising actually we can regulate this. Actually, it is possible to remove content or stifle access to things that are harmful or not regulated or not licensed. So I think that was a big mistake. And all these companies, as a result of that attitude, which was pervasive between 2005 and 2014 when we started regulating online gambling, were able to move offshore, access the British market without paying tax, without regulation, build their asset values, basically develop principles of operation that if you wanted to start now and say, we'll start from year zero where there's no online gambling, you wouldn't in a million years allow them to do the things that they're doing. You would set up very strict rules about how that can be operated and to protect consumers. So I think we've been trying to retrofit regulation onto this sector for a long time, and I think the cultural acceptability of gambling is as a result of them having lots of resources that they can market to people and to generate that kind of perception.
So the Act is 2005. This is before smartphones, as you said, and AI as well.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a case of legislation can't really keep up with the speed that the technology of these companies is going?
I think there's a really strong case for some kind of digital addiction oversight that perhaps even supersedes the Gambling Commission. I think that there has to be a recognition that smartphones are addictive. The products or the type of content that's on smartphones is addictive. It's optimized to drive engagement, whether that's gambling or social media apps or dating apps or whatever it is. These are all part of the same, they're using the same techniques, really. The gambling industry is like a test lab for a lot of these techniques that we see, right, to drive engagement. And I think that then there needs to be a recognition that this is, if it's not a public health issue already, it has the potential to be. Gambling is really at the sharp end of digital addiction, because not only are you, they're monetizing your time, but through losses rather than through sort of ad revenue or data harvesting. They're monetizing, so basically you have the potential with gambling through that engagement that they're driving to lose everything very quickly. So I think it's incumbent on policymakers to recognise that this is, has the potential to be a big problem, and we need policies that protect the population from those harms.
So the Gambling Commission do have the ability to give out fines. I think the biggest one they gave out was around 19 million.
Yeah.
This is to a company with a revenue of 1.7 billion, so it's a bit of a drop in the ocean, really, and they could put it down as a cost of doing business. And do you think the regulatory system needs somewhat reworking?
I think one of the problems that the Gambling Commission has is that it hasn't been able to take action quickly enough against operators that breach the licence conditions. And sometimes these audits and these investigations can take a year, and the Gambling Commission is only allowed to revoke a licence as a last resort to uphold the licensing objectives. So the gambling operator could theoretically in that context argue that because it's been a year since you started the investigation, we've changed, this is not a last resort, and the Gambling Commission is always concerned that they would lose in court in that context. Now, what the Gambling Act Review White Paper did was it gave the Gambling Commission power to access data, operator data in almost real time, to do those compliance assessments much more rapidly. And from my perspective, if you've got a regulator that isn't able to, whether that's because of a legal loophole or because of lack of powers, if it isn't able to revoke a licence, then there's no point in anything else. Because unless you can administer the ultimate sanction, then, as you say, it's a cost of doing business. Any fine is a cost of doing business, unless it's levied at such a significant level that they have no choice but to want to avoid it, which, I mean, we're quite a way away from that happening if the fines keep going up. But it doesn't seem to have had any impact on their behaviour. The bigger fines up to this point have not really had that catalyst, have not been a catalyst for that change that we need.
So you mentioned the animosity. Did a lot of these changes happen because of the appetite for the public?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there was no real demand from the public for liberalisation of gambling. Absolutely not. I don't know if you remember, in 2005, the discourse around then was just dominated by super casinos and this idea that we can use sort of US investment in super casinos to regenerate places like Blackpool and other areas of Britain that, and there was no public demand for that. And
so was it Gordon Brown who stopped that in the end?
Yeah, so the great irony with Gordon Brown is he's a sort of Presbyterian, very anti-gambling, and he put a stop to that when he came in. So there has been no super casinos as a result of the 2005 Gambling Act. But obviously there was then fixed odds betting terminals that were legitimised in that legislation, and more than 30,000 of those machines ended up on our high streets.
Right.
And then subsequent to the 2005 Gambling Act and the principles of that legislation, we've had it's been very slow to regulate online gambling since 2014. It's been quite difficult, I think, to do that properly and to do that quickly. So I think there's still a legacy there, even though Gordon Brown put a stop to the super casinos. A lot of his acolytes as well, a lot of people around Gordon Brown ended up going to work for the gambling lobby. Many of them still do. So they're very well connected to the Labour Party at the moment. But as I say, I'm hoping that the Labour Party can see that this is a popular agenda and that there's a need to address this from a public health perspective. And if they're serious about preventing health harms before people need treatment, then they'll look at policies that reduce the harm.
And putting the policy side of things aside, what can people do to deal with this problem from a kind of personal level?
I think if you want to quit gambling, then the best thing to do is self-exclude. And if you're gambling online, you can do that through GamStop. And also, and GamStop is brilliant. It will stop you signing up to any of the regulated gambling operators.
So it somehow prevents you from accessing the sites?
Yes. And I would also then layer it up with blocking software to stop you accessing unregulated sites and things like crypto and trading platforms, which can obviously lead to gambling harm as well. And the software I founded, Gamban, provides that. And you can get that for free through talkbanstop.com. And through there, you can also refer yourself to treatment services, including NHS services. There's also things you can do with your bank as well now. So banks are offering transaction blocks, and some of the best ones like Monzo. You can switch that on, and then it takes you like a few days or however long you want to set the calling off period if you ever want to switch it off again. So that stops you depositing the money into the gambling account. So I think getting the barriers in place is really important. You will have an urge to gamble if you're trying to quit. And what these barriers do is they create enough friction that that urge eventually will subside. But it just gives you the breathing space to access treatment and support. And I was in treatment for about 3 months. I did relapse after, but I quit. From the moment I said I was trying to quit desperately when I was suicidal. From that moment until I actually had my last bet was about 6 months. So it's a process, and it's like any addiction. You just have to keep going, and then eventually you get there. There's lots of other peer support groups out there as well. So there's things like GamLearn, GamFam. There's Gambling with Lives. If you know someone who's been bereaved by gambling-related suicide, Gambling with Lives, fantastic. So I think there's lots of like groups out there now that can help people, and it's important that people recognise that there is support out there that's free.
Matt Zarb-Cousin, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.